you very much.
Okay, so thank you very much for Maya. It's very insightful lecture. Let's see, guys, if you have any further questions, please write them down.
Lior, Asaf had a question
Yes.
regarding the usage of generative AI as part of malware. And most likely, Asaf, I think that you thought about malware creation with Gen AI. Now, most of the new models that are publicated and not privately owned, they will not allow you to generate a malware code because of specific restrictions, security restrictions, etc. There was a research by several cybersecurity researchers that showed that it's possible to create a constantly changing malware code using generative AI. And this can be done easily, not using the actual interface of the web UI, but using the API. And just one way that it can be done is by calling OpenAI or OpenAI API to modify the code after execution, meaning most of the malware have several stages. When the first file is just a stager file that is being used, is some kind of a JavaScript file or something that will not actually download the full malware payload, and it will connect to some other command and control site or some hacked website, and will try to download the code of the malware from there. As you know, and as Abraham mentioned, most of the endpoint security and the antiviruses, the modern antiviruses, the MDRs and the XDRs, are using two different ways in order to understand if something is the malware or not. First of all, is if I have a signature of this code. So by utilizing the ChatGPT type of API calls, I can ask the generative AI just to modify a specific code that I already have. And since it's something that is new, it will not catch on any stamps that are from hash or some other ways to understand that it's a malicious code. This is one method that can be utilized in order to bypass restriction. The second, most of the new EDRs have other behavioral capabilities to detect this malware, but I will not go into that right now. One thing that we need to remember, once utilizing generative AI, I'm especially focusing on OpenAI, and it was mentioned from a privacy leakage or generating some content that is restricted. But there is another side of using the code that it is being generated. Now, you need to understand that this code is something that came from scraping Stack Overflow and other types of sites that not always provide a very accurate code snippets. And if you don't verify the code that was presented or produced by the LLM, you may find yourself in a place that you can be hacked by this code. So one thing that you need to check is, okay, the AI generated just an amazing Python code, okay, and I just copy paste as is, but without the verification, you don't know if the code was sanitized properly and is not opening you to an attack. And just on this question, on this answer, I want to elaborate. You need to understand that the code that is being generated is not always secure, there is no static code analysis, no dynamic code analysis, no pentest done on this code that was generated. So using it as is may introduce some security vulnerabilities that a simple IDE can just identify very easily, but you don't use an IDE. It's like using an open source code that you just found in the internet. And there are many restrictions on introducing code from directly from Docker Hub or from Git repositories. The same way should go for using LLM, large language models, or generative AI capabilities.
Okay.
Abraham, do you want to add?
I want to keep up time, so I'm sorry for that. We need to have a keep up time on the schedule. So Alex, thank you very much for this elaboration and answering the questions. Thank you very much on that. And it's very interesting topic. The AI is evolving and will continue to evolve. And as I heard in some other lecture, the other side of innovation is cybersecurity. So always AI and cybersecurity goes along as any innovation. And without further ado, I do want to invite Abraham again to talk about the value of public pen test reports and interesting vulnerabilities, as you mentioned, Abraham, in your last conversation. In order to validate the company, to choose the right penetration test company, you need to review their public reports. So I assume that you will share with us several interesting vulnerabilities that you found.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. So yeah, let's get started because there's not much time left. So we already went through who I am, so I'm just going to skip this. Now, public Pentest reports, there's a lot more coming. These are the ones that we could publish from this year, but there's at least 3 more from this year that will be published very shortly. Maybe more famously will be NVM, which everybody uses. So NVM, the audit that we did will be published by December 1st, and one of the issues we found will get a CVE, right? So just to say that. So okay, so let's just jump into it, right? So all this is just public, right? So you can just go to cybersecurity.com, publications, and in there you can download everything, right? So there are a few here that got a little bit more media attention. So Leave Home Safe is an application that was kind of mandated in Hong Kong. So in theory, it was not mandated. In practice, you had to scan the code everywhere to see if you had been in contact with somebody infected by COVID. So to go to the underground, to go to a restaurant, to go to church, to go to the gym, if you want to leave, you had to scan the code, right? So basically, everybody was kind of forced to run this app. And I actually will be speaking about Leave Home Safe at DeepSec this week. And I also gave this talk at LASCON in Austin, Texas, a couple of weeks ago. So, okay. So with that, let's see, why are public reports valuable and useful to learn about security vulnerabilities, right? So there's a few purposes here, right? So this is a learning opportunity, right? Because if you read public Pentest reports from any company, right, hopefully a good one, but in general, right, if you read public Pentest reports, you can learn a lot about security, right? Because you can see vulnerabilities that are found in real applications that companies are testing, right? You can also see like emerging threats, right? So if there's some type of specific vulnerability that is new and starts happening more and more, you can see about that. So for example, we've done a lot of public Pentest reports with supply chain analysis, right? So a lot of projects have been hacked, not because of a vulnerability in the project, but because of a supply chain attack against an open source project, right? Normally open source projects are maintained by volunteers who do stuff in their spare time. So if you hack the volunteer, then you can maybe compromise like 1 million users that are using that open source project, right? For example, right? So that will be an example of a relatively new emerging threat would be like supply chain attacks, right? So yeah, and we test for that like slightly differently, right? So there's like a supply chain analysis section in the report. It's not like specific like findings. And this also sets like a benchmark for security standards, right? So you can see what's the standard for an effective security assessment as opposed to a bullshit report, copy and paste it from Nessus or some other automated tool, right? So you can see what to expect, basically, right? And it can also be like a benchmark to evaluate the quality of the Pentest company and so on, right? So you can, yeah, use it to evaluate security companies. It's like a tangible demonstration and allows potential clients to assess the expertise and thoroughness of the testing team and things like that. So for that purpose, it can also be helpful. And it can also help you with risk assessment and mitigation, right? So as I said before, you can check, well, I have an Android app, what types of vulnerabilities are like in public Pentest reports for Android apps, and how can I mitigate those? And then you can be more efficient because you're mitigating vulnerabilities that people normally find in mobile apps as opposed to like random stuff, right? So you're like focusing on the more important things that are normally reported, right? And then this can also be helpful for compliance and regulations. But let's jump to the actual, vulnerability. But in general, they are invaluable resource for the cybersecurity community, right? So you can use it as a learning tool, you can use it to evaluate security companies, you can use it as benchmark, educational material, and overall improvement of security practices, right? So to improve the security of what you're doing as well as for learning and stuff like that, right? So I'm just going to show some examples, random examples from public Pentest reports. So some mobile app vulnerability examples. Now, Argo VPN is actually, it was a really well-written application. For the time we found actually very little, but it had a problem, right? So let me explain first. So this was a DNS spoofing, a denial of service through DNS spoofing, which 90% of mobile apps will be vulnerable to. But in this specific example, it was a high severity issue because of the purpose of this app, right? So Argo VPN, this is the logo of the application. It's a free VPN app for Android, but it's for bypassing internet censorship in Iran, right? So if you have a denial of service against this app, you have someone in Iran who cannot reach the quote unquote free Western internet, which we see what Google and Facebook wants us to see and other companies, right? So it's not like completely free, but at least it's better than what the Iranian government wants you to see, right? So in that sense, it's kind of freer than than the normal, stuff that they have in Iran, right? So it allows to access blocked websites, online services, social media, messaging apps, and so on in Iran, which otherwise would not be possible because the Iranian government is like basically monitoring everything, right? So it's actually a really cool project. I recommend that you use it, and it was actually very good. The impression that we got from the test, we found almost nothing, but this was an interesting vulnerability. So let's just show it, right? So now this happened because actually the Iranian ISPs block DNS over TLS, right? So DNS over TLS is when you do a DNS request. Now DNS is a clear text protocol, so everybody can change it, right? So if you have man in the middle of clear text traffic, you can change the DNS record to whatever you want, and then you can sometimes man in the middle that way, right? But in Iran, because of all these restrictions, they are actually blocking DNS over TLS and DNS over HTTPS, right? So there's these DOT and DOH protocols that are used to secure the insecure DNS traffic, which is clear text over TLS, right? So they have to revert back to regular DNS, but this is prone to spoofing, right? So the Argo authenticator pins the key, so you cannot man in the middle, but DNS spoofing is still effective for denial of service purposes. So this is like a high severity vulnerability in this case because the Iranian user that is trying to access the quote unquote free internet cannot, right? So for this attack, we had to simulate that we are in Iran, even though we are not. So we use Frida, as Alex showed before, to instrument the application so that it would behave as if it was in Iran, so that we can test for this thing. And then what we did is just using, so we use like a Frida script to fake that we are in Iran, and then using DNS Chef, we can spoof DNS responses for the specific servers that Argo VPN is trying to connect to, and then we give like an invalid fake IP, and then Argo VPN cannot connect to the VPN, and then the Iranian user cannot access the free internet, which is the entire point of this application, right? So this is also why the severity of the vulnerability depends on the business context of the application, right? So in this context, this is bad because the Iranian user cannot access the free internet, right? So this was the error message. And then, this would be, it was also possible through another technique, but I want to show you more vulnerabilities and we don't have a lot of time. So I'll just jump through this, but basically it was like a denial of service through DNS spoofing, right? So in this case, and this is also why you need a manual pen test, what we recommended is implement not yet blocked encrypted methods for DNS resolution, right? So there are actually a couple of new protocols, DNS over QUIC and DNS over HTTP3. So these protocols could be considered as an alternative because they are encrypted, they are resilient to packet losses, and they require sensors to employ new strategies. So they can achieve what they want to achieve, which is provide Iranian users to access to the free internet, whereas they would not be blocked, right? And then they could have fallback mechanisms, right? So if one DNS resolution method doesn't work, they could fall back to another, right? So this would be our recommendation and why you need a manual pen test. So now let's see other issues, right? So this is man in the middle without warnings through clear text MQTT traffic, right? So MQTT traffic is sometimes an overlooked source of trouble, especially when you have like IoT type stuff going on with mobile apps. And this was found in Bridgefy, right? So they obviously patched all this. But Bridgefy is actually a really cool application. So it offers offline messaging. So it works without the need for an internet connection, for emergency communication, and then you have event reliability, and it's education friendly, right? So it's useful for school, colleges, and institutions with limited or restricted internet access. So the context of this would be New York goes out of power, right? So mobile towers will have 30 minutes. The power supplies they have will be gone in 30 minutes, right? In most places. So without internet, without power, how can people talk to each other, right? So this is where Bridgefy comes in. It allows you to tunnel messages through each other using Bluetooth, right? And actually that part was pretty solid because we didn't find any problems with that because they used lip signal, right? So again, using good libraries can sometimes result in greater software security, right? So let's see the vulnerability. So this was a man-in-the-middle attack, and it was possible to obtain MQTT credentials, subscribe to topics, and so on. So let's just show the proof of concept here. You can capture the traffic, generate some MQTT traffic by exercising the application. So we captured like the clear text traffic, and then when you inspect it, you could base64 decode the JWT token. You should always base64 decode JWT tokens. And in here, you can see like we have the phone number of the user, the password, and other stuff that people should be able to see, right? And all this was being sent in clear text, right? So you could see people's phone numbers and stuff like that in clear text, right? Anybody with man in the middle. So this was pretty bad, right? And then there were different possible attacks with this. So you could access messages sent between users and stuff like that with this. So this is why this was critical, was because you could actually intercept the communications between users, right? Once you had access to the password and so on. So the root cause in this case was they were publishing MQTT connections using clear text, enable SSL. You can see it's set to false, so pretty bad, right? And this was basically why it was working. Now, it's important to mention that in modern iOS and Android versions, this will actually not work by default because iOS and Android will block clear text communications by default, but developers can turn this off. So when you're auditing mobile applications, you should always look for this. Are the developers defeating the platform protections for clear text, right? So in this case, you have NS allow arbitrary loads set to true. So this means that the application will happily load clear text HTTP communications, right? Which is bad. Now we have the same for Android, clear text using the base URL, which is using clear text. And then again, in Android, because this is forbidden by default, you have to add this, right? Android uses clear text traffic set to true, right? So this is bad. You should never do this if you are a developer, because then you are defeating the platform protections to avoid clear text HTTP traffic. Right, so this would be the recommendations. Basically, use MQTT over TLS, and then TLS will take care of the confidentiality and integrity of communications, right? Okay, so now let's see some web and API vulnerability examples. So this was from WebPN, which is very cool, right? So it's also for internet freedom, but in this case, people have an IoT device in a not censored country, and then they share this with their family in Iran, China, or some other country that is censored, right? So the cool thing about this is that it's very difficult for the censor to randomly block random IPs from consumers in the planet, right? Because your IoT device in your non-censored country is acting as the VPN server for these people that are in a censored country, right? So very cool concept. Actually, the project was also like very high quality, and they fixed everything, right, including the vulnerability that I'm going to show. So let's just come to the vulnerability, okay? So this was an insecure direct object reference with a twist, right? So it was also, you could view it as HTTP parameter pollution, right? So let's see how it works. So you create two users. One is the attacker and one is the victim. You can see they have a different ID, right? So this is the attacker ID with attacker, and this is the victim ID with victim at cybersecurity.com, right? So just create two users. Then we log in as the attacker. So this is like the request to log in as the attacker, and we get the access token, right? So until here, everything's normal. There's no attack yet. Okay. Now we verify that the token belongs to the attacker account. So you make the request with the access token, and you can see that, yes, this is actually belongs to the attacker user, right? So until here, everything's normal. Now this is the attack, right? So this is very cool, and you should always try this against Python applications, especially Django applications, right? Because normally the way they tend to implement access control is they check the URL, right? They check if the user ID that you're logged in as matches the ID in the URL, right? So in this case, you can see that the attacker URL pretends that they are patching or updating their own profile, right? So you're making the request to patch your own profile, API user, my attacker ID, so this seems legit, but the trick is here, right? So in the post request, we are setting the ID of the victim, right? So this is kind of an IDOR because you're using the ID of another user, but you are also using your ID in the URL to bypass the security check, right? So what happened here? With the ID in the URL, we bypass the security check, and then because post text takes normally precedence over get, the application, the endpoint that was actually doing the stuff, was already past the security check, and then it used this ID for the victim ID instead of the one in the URL, right? Because this one in the post body of the request has higher priority, let's say, right? So the cool thing about this is that then you can change the email address of another user to an email address that you control, right? So now we have the victim ID with a different email address that the attacker controls, right? And then what we can do is use the forgot password functionality, and then we set the email address that we control, and then we get, the password reset token for the victim user, and then we can take over the victim account, right? So this was a very cool attack for this, and I'm not sure if I will have, well, this was the verification of the full takeover. So, and this was the root cause, right? So it was basically processing the body of the request, but the serializer was taking the ID from the post body instead of the ID from the URL, right? So the ID from the URL bypassed the security check, whereas the ID from the post body was doing the attack and updating somebody else's account, right? So this was a very cool attack. I'm not sure if I should jump to the questions or can I like stretch this a little bit? What do you think, Lior?
You can continue a little bit and then we'll go to the questions.
Okay. So I'll just skip the recommendations there. And then this was an admin access through a weak password policy, right? So now this is again on BridgeFi. Now BridgeFi, we tested a lot of things, so the attack surface was huge. We tested the websites, we tested the mobile apps and so on, right? So there was a lot of stuff. So let's just come to what you are interested about, which is the vulnerability. Okay. So in this case, there was a Firebase REST API which failed to validate the password strength. So things like same password as login or 123456 were allowed. But the EMX dashboard implemented an even worse password policy where even 123 gets accepted as a password on the login page, right? So what we could do is basically brute force the password and gain admin access. So let's just see how this works. So you do echo bridgefly, and then you put that into seeds.txt. Then we use this script, OS Mangler, to generate some passwords based on the customer name, right, bridgefly. And then this generated 700 passwords with combinations, different combinations of this word, right? So then this was the bash script, which is basically trying to log in to the staging server with username admin and the password in those 700 passwords, right? So there was no password brute force or anything, and then we could log in basically, right? So then you can navigate to the sign up and so on, and then you can also try like this weak password. But basically, you could the main thing is this, right? So using the script, you could actually like brute force the admin password and get in just because of a weak password policy and a weak password that was in place for the admin. Let me see if I can show you one last one, which is a single packet denial of service through a spoofed UDP handshake response, right? So this was a very cool attack because with TCP, there's a three-way handshake, so you cannot spoof the IP address, but with UDP, because of the way UDP works, you can actually spoof a packet and say that it's from somebody else because there's no handshake, right? So the advantage of UDP is it's faster because there's no handshake, so there's less traffic. But the disadvantage is that you can spoof IP addresses and do other crazy stuff, right? So in this case, we found a real attack against a VPN application, right? So this is attack against a VPN application we tested called Mini VPN, which is a cool open source project. It was also pretty good, right? So we actually didn't find too much, but it was pretty cool because you could like crash the application and then be able to kill the VPN, which is the entire point of a VPN application, right? If you can crash the VPN and the user cannot use it, then if they are on a hostile network, they're kind of forced. If they need to access the internet for something urgent, then you can man in the middle and everything else, right? So we use the exploit like this, and then this was to run the mini VPN client. So this scenario to prevent new VPN connections, and this was the exploit code. So we used, in this case, KP to craft packets, and then we just used like a bad packet format. So we send this using the Python script, and then this was the output from the client. Then you had to send a SOX proxy request from another terminal, and then you can see here that you can complete the SOX connection to see what's your IP because the VPN application has been crashed, basically, right? And you can see here, fail to handle request, fail bad VPN handshake, bad reset packet, bad header, and basically the application crashes and nobody can use the VPN, which is the entire point of a VPN application, right? So denial of service type attacks against VPN clients is also an interesting target. Okay, so we don't have, I believe, time for much else. So yeah, well, this was a cloud example for possible IAM admin takeover through excessive privileges, right? So this would be the type of issues that you find in cloud audits where you have access to some stuff and then this gives you access to something else that you shouldn't have access to, right? So admin access propagates to other accounts as any user with this particular role can gain administrative access in this other place in AWS. And basically, this is how a lot of AWS or cloud audits go, right? Like you have access to certain things, but then because of some misconfiguration, users can escalate privileges, right? So that's basically the story. So a malicious attacker can compromise a single highly privileged account and could take over the entire IAM infrastructure and potentially pivot to other environments and so on, right? So yeah, this will be the way to verify this. You can see all users administrators, and then you can take the policy, which is what is allowing this, that you have allow with a resource star, and then this is what leads to the takeover. Okay, I think we are out of time. So with that, if you have any questions, and I'll put this in the chat as well.
Yes, I've actually also published a link to more public Pentest reports. So everything that Abraham stated here, if you want to review those vulnerabilities and more public reports, you can go to their website, the 7A Security, and see all those kind of vulnerability. I think it's a good insight to see which kind of vulnerability there are out there, learn if you want, and be exposed to new kind of vulnerabilities and attacks. So you can go and see on one side how to attack or be a hacker, a white hacker, and on the other side, like what will be the remediation. So from a defender point of view, just take those recommendations coming from Abraham and his team and implement it in your developing life cycle. So Abraham, thank you very much for the insightful lecture and some highlights from a hacker point of view and a real vulnerability. It's real, it's out there, and thank you for that. Guys, if you have any further questions, please write them down in the Q&A. Me, Abraham, Alex will answer all your questions if you have any. But you got very good insight related to how hacker thinks, why you should do penetration testing, guys. Not everything can be done automatically, as Abraham said in the beginning. There are several attack vector, business logic, like hacking games that Alex presented. Also vulnerabilities coming from AI, like your supply chain and other vulnerabilities coming from LLM model that you've integrated or you are using. So don't trust anyone. Check, do the penetration test. It could be a combination between automatic and manual. However, keep in mind that automatically will not bring you many vulnerabilities that a manual penetration test can bring. So guys, if you have any further questions, please write them down in the chat. Abraham also send you in the chat itself. You send to all, Abraham, the links?
Yeah. I send it to everybody.
Okay. One last comment. All the session recordings will be uploaded to our LinkedIn page and will be published over there. So keep tuned. And of course, each and every meetup is being published over there. So follow us. We have also the monthly publication, the newsletter. So very interesting. Keep in touch, and you are all welcome to come to our meetup. So guys, if there aren't any further questions in the Q&A, I do want to thank you very much, Abraham and Alex. I know it's a rough situation sometimes, and I truly think that our meetups bring light to our audience and for sharing knowledge to all. So please all be safe, keep safe, and thank you very much. Thank you very much all. Thank you, Abraham. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Lior. Thank you for the audience in this time. Thank you.
Bye for now. Bye.
Bye.